Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this very important conversation. Before we get started on this very important conversation, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations across Turtle Island. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we must recognize the importance of the land and our treaty agreements. We acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. Further, we reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improve our own understanding of Indigenous peoples, their cultures, and their histories. We recognize our shared and continued responsibility to honor, respect, and care for the natural world around us as it supports and grounds us every day in our journey on this land. Let these words serve to center our thoughts on the enduring Indigenous presence and the Indigenous right to self-determination, while recognizing the historical and current oppression of Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world. Let us acknowledge our privilege and work together to decolonize systems as we begin to engage in new ways of learning, being, and doing. Let us build relationships that honor and uphold the voice and values of our Indigenous hosts. Thank you all for being here today. In recognition of Spinal Cord Injury Ontario's Rolling Through Barriers campaign, we are excited to have this conversation on accessible and affordable housing today. We have a very exciting panel to address a lot of conversations with regards to accessible and affordable housing. And I'd also like to acknowledge we have many people with spinal cord injuries that are here today, and recognizing the challenge and the crisis that people with spinal cord injuries and other physical disabilities face when accessibility is not available. For those of you that are not aware, when a person sustains a spinal cord injury and then enters rehabilitation, they basically have about 4 to 6 months before they get to go home into an accessible house. And most often than not, those housings are not available. So today's conversation is about how we smash those barriers and how can we make an affordable and accessible Canada for our future. So I'm going to start with our panelists, and I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves and provide 5 minutes of what accessible housing means to them. Noma, I'm going to start with you. Please introduce yourself, please.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's Noma Hamash here, Regional Services Coordinator at Spinal Cord Injury Ontario, working with clients starting from rehab or sometimes even before that. I have a lived experience also with a neuromuscular disease. So personally, I live the crisis of housing and I deal with it every day with my clients. You asked me, Peter, what accessible housing to me means. It's actually, for me, it's where I can live as independently as I can physically without external barriers or challenges, whether environmental or policy related and rules related. So I want to be able to access my oven, my kitchen countertop, my bathroom, my sink, my patio or balcony. I want to be able to move around in my apartment without having to hit the walls all the time. I need enough wide doorways within my unit, for example. I need to be able to access my laundry room if I live in whether in a house or whether even in a building where sometimes the laundry room is on a different, it's not in the unit, for example. Another thing that I noticed recently, I'll give an example that would demonstrate and paint the picture. A building in Toronto is designated for persons with disabilities and seniors only. Recently, they decided to make their visitors' parkings paid. So that means that the PSWs and the attendants will have challenges parked there. The community nurses, when they come, they have challenges parked there. Somebody mentioned that the wheelchair needs fixing. So somebody came to them, but because they had to park far away, they couldn't move to take the tools with them. So they went up to the unit, they took the wheelchair to the van, they fixed it and they got it back. And that time, extra time, needs to be paid by that person with disability. So like this rule, for example, of making the visitor parking of the building paid is really a barrier. This rule is a barrier to meeting the needs of these people. It is becoming really a challenge. Affordability is the other part. Many people with disabilities can either work part-time, for example, or are on CPP disability or ODSP, so they don't really make much money. Ironically, some people think that if you are receiving government assistance, your medication is covered, your home modification is covered. That's not true. The government or the programs that are available, they can only cover part of the home renovation, part of the vehicle modification. Your supplements will not be covered. Some of the assistive tools that you need in your kitchen are not covered. We need sometimes adaptive clothing. We maybe have 2, 3, 4 vendors only, and they are expensive. We have a lot of expenses, a lot actually. So adding to that, to market rent is almost impossible for people. In my work, like almost in every family meeting where the medical team and the Toronto Rehab plus us, SCI Ontario, we plan for the client's discharge, housing is almost the first on the top, the first on the list, almost always there. People would ask, where would I leave Lyndhurst to? Where would I go to? I had clients in their 50s who started considering long-term care because they cannot find accessible place and they cannot afford, even if they find one that is market rent, they cannot afford it. A person in their 50s considering long-term care, that's not right. That's not right at all. Access to housing, which is the umbrella or the central, they manage the wait list for all the subsidized housing. Access to housing, wait list for accessible subsidized units is 10 years plus. That's a lot. And now, starting January, they are introducing a policy where they offer people only one option. So you take it or you leave it. If you don't take it, you are removed, you apply again. So also that's not right. I want to live where I want, where I can be in my community or around my family or my friends. Location, the rules, the physical barriers, all of these things are challenges to call it an accessible place where I will come back from work to the comfort of my home. That's my observation personally and working with my clients.
Well, you know, Noma, recognizing that people with disabilities are the largest minority in this country, we really need to prioritize much better in terms of supporting the needs and people with disabilities so people can live the life they choose. Clearly, we're not seeing that right now, and that's the conversation we want to lead. So thank you for your comments about that. I'd like to hear from our next panelists, Rob Oliphant, our MP in Don Valley. Congratulations on the elections. What I'd like the audience to recognize about Rob that's unique is his riding actually represents the majority of disability organizations in his riding. So he has a unique position where he can be a very large voice for us. So thank you, Rob, for being here today. And what does accessibility mean to you?
Thank you, Peter. And I just begin with a shout out to Spinal Cord Injury Ontario and your siblings across the country and the work you do. the work you do with direct client care, the work you do with respect to advocacy on behalf of people with spinal cord injury, as well as your good humor and patience with all of the things that you as an organization and individuals within it need to face. So thank you for your work. It is a great privilege to be the Member of Parliament for Don Valley West. We have a plethora of organizations with either regional head offices or national head offices dealing with a full range of disability and inclusion issues. And so it keeps me on the ball. It keeps me, obviously, my work with the Accessibility Act, getting that to the finish line, working with Minister Qualtrough on that, working on funding projects as well has been something that I've enjoyed. When I'm thinking about housing and people with disabilities, I've got three words in my head. I'm a preacher by background, so I tend to think in threes. That's what we're trained to do. And they all begin with C's. So that is to try to help me organize my thinking. When I think about housing that is accessible, I think about cost, I think about convenience, and I think about comfort. And Numa's already raised some of those issues, but I would say that when I talk to constituents, one of the overwhelming barriers to housing has to do with poverty and the incidence of poverty, precarious employment, and the lack of accommodation in the workplace for people with disabilities that can make a huge difference. When I talk to people with a variety of disabilities, I am constantly amazed at the energy and the passion they put into wanting to be a part of the economy, wanting to be part of making a difference in the workplace, and how little it takes for employers to actually do that. But the reluctance of many employers to engage on that. So cost is a factor. Just as women make less on the dollar than men do, people with disabilities make less on the dollar than people without disabilities do. And so their housing needs to be affordable. And the measures of affordability need to be put in place to recognize the systemic barriers with people with disabilities when it comes to earning a living and generating wealth and all of that. So cost is first, and governments at all levels need to be aware of that. The second thing has to do with convenience. And I think that's what Numa is talking about the design, and I'm looking forward to what Brock has to say about that, about the way we design living spaces that don't make it an add-on or an adaptation, but are integral to the design of a living space that recognizes people with differences. When I renovated the last church that I was in, we had an old building, and I said in that renovation, I didn't want a ramp. If we are going to spend $6 million renovating a building, surely we could design it so that there was not a ramp, that there was equal access to everybody in the front door. And the designers and architects had to scratch their head, but they came up with it because there should be no difference. It needs to be convenient. It needs to be designed in such a way that people can reach the things, access the things, live a fully, and I use the word normal in parentheses, a fully accessible life equal to what I am able to do as someone without those same disabilities. So convenience has to be part of it. The third one is comfort. And I should say on the convenience thing, that's also about where that housing is. It's not only internally convenient, but externally convenient, close to transit, close to accessible walkways and pathways and transit to make sure that people can contribute and can live life in our economic structures we have. The third one has to do with comfort. And it has to be that the design has to be unique for the individual, because there are no two people with disabilities that are the same. And there has to be a way to make a living space personal and real and individual the way anybody else would. And that takes society to say we want to level the playing field in every aspect of our life. The reason I am happy to pay my tax dollars, and I am genuinely happy, is to make sure that we have a level playing field for everyone. And so on the National Housing Strategy, we need to have a concept, not only of barrier-free, that's fine, that's only a start. Barrier-free is a start. Fully accessible and inclusive, comfortable, convenient, and at a price that is affordable is critical. The last point I would raise, and I could go on for hours, is that, and it's a story Peter's heard before, it's about a friend that I met in Ottawa who suffered a spinal cord injury. He is very disabled. That'd be the reality. He's a quadriplegic, and he has had to find ways to adapt. I met him when he was a master's student at Carleton University, and he was staying in residence at Carleton because the wait list for housing in Ottawa was so long that if he left his university, he would actually not have an affordable, comfortable, convenient place to live. And that's wrong. So we have to do better. The National Housing Strategy is part of that. National building standards and codes where, working with the Rick Hansen Foundation, et cetera, to make sure that we have standards that builders will be having to uphold and municipalities will enforce. So we're there, long way to go, but those are opening thoughts. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rob. The 3 C's are hugely important, and it continues to, we're already continuing to hear a trend here on just the inconvenience that is being created on the programs and services, and not the natural seamlessness of just giving people what they need. Thank you for your remarks, Rob. Our next speaker is Jas Great, who's one of our peer mentor coordinators. Jas Great, please provide us your experience on what accessible housing means to you.
For sure. So I guess I'll probably touch on some things that Numa mentioned and maybe even some things that Rob mentioned. So my name is Jas Great. I am one of the peer program coordinators here in Toronto with Spinal Cord Injury Ontario. I am a person with a disability. I have a spinal cord injury. I acquired my injury 17 years ago. So a little bit of what Numa mentioned in rehab hospital. So I was injured when I was a kid. I went to a rehab hospital. My home was not accessible at all before. I went home to a house that had steps. So I was carried in, and then I could not leave, and I couldn't shower because we didn't have an accessible bathroom yet. I was fortunate, and this fund is still around. So through the March of Dimes Home Modification Fund, I was able to get an accessible bathroom, and I'm not sure if it was through them or some other funding, but I was able to get a lift installed to get into my house. So I was able to get in, but I still lived on the first floor, and the living room became my bedroom. And we talked about, quote unquote normal. I think that Rob mentioned that, and I didn't feel normal or regular or a student or a kid or a teenager or a person living on the first floor in my family's living room. It just did not feel how I felt I needed to feel just after an injury. It just was not nice. We did move into a raised bungalow. I had my own bedroom. That was really nice. And just throughout life, I've used the Gauge Transition to Independent Living program to move out on my own. That was my first experience in a fully accessible apartment, one where I could get in safely, where I could wash my hands, where I could bathe without difficulties, that I could access the kitchen, I could access everything that I needed to. That one didn't have a laundry room in my unit, but downstairs, but also something that was easily accessible with attendants. And from there, I moved into my own apartment, which was also accessible. And as Numa touched on, I did have ODSP, but then as I started working, because I wanted to work, that got cut down. I had to start paying market rent. And with all of the other expenses that I have, I realized I probably can't live on my own. like this for very long. So I did move back home to my parents' house. And I'm going to say I am very fortunate on my accessible housing journey. With their help and with work, I was able to move into my own place again. And this was something that we bought pre-construction, and I worked with the builder to make my unit accessible. And so just looking around, I realized that making a unit accessible is not that difficult. Yes, I had to work within some of their limits, and there was an extra cost for me, which I'm going to say did not think was fair, because not very much looks different than what it was supposed to look like. But I do know that it is possible. So I feel like I'm rambling on a little bit, so I apologize for that. And so you asked, what does accessible housing mean? Accessible housing to me is a house that I can access and I can function in independently and safely. It doesn't necessarily mean that I need to be able to reach the top shelves as a person who uses a chair. Those top shelves are wonderful for storage sometimes. So it doesn't mean that I need to reach those, but it does mean that I need to be able to get in safely. It does mean that once I'm in, and now we were talking about COVID and hand washing was huge, it does mean I need to have a place that I can roll under, that I can wash my hands once I come inside. It means I need to be able to do my day-to-day activities without struggling, that I can cook for myself, that I can wash my own dishes, that I'm not twisting to roll, twisting to do what I need to do. It's just, an accessible house is one that is easy to access. It's one where I can do what I need to. And I think, we all deserve such a space. So that's accessible housing for me.
Yeah, Jas Great, in 2021, asking to be safe and independent in your own home in Canada should not be something that you should be struggling to achieve. Thank you for your remarks.
Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our last panelist, Brock Stevenson, who's the director at Daniels Corp. Provide us a perspective from a builder's point of view. Brock, what does accessible housing mean to you from your perspective?
Thank you. Yeah, hi, my name's Brock Stevenson. I'm the Director of Building Design and Innovation at Daniels. For anyone who's not aware, Daniels is a fully integrated self-performing builder developer in Toronto. We've gone through the process over the last number of years of creating lots of specific programs. And I guess my role at Daniels is to try to drive design-related consistency and procedural consistency across our entire portfolio of projects. So it's a very challenging task when we have 12 to 14 projects online at any one time, but it's something that we take very seriously. So one of the programs we've developed recently is the accessibility design program. So we launched this actually back in 2017. And in our mind, this implements very thoughtful design elements that go way above and beyond OBC minimum requirements for accessibility. And I guess just to answer the question more kind of directly, in my mind, accessible housing, should feel dignified. It should feel generous. It should feel very well designed, and it should feel beautiful. I think about what I want in my own house when I come home, as an able-bodied person. You want it to be comfortable. You want to be able to be yourself. That is incredibly important. So, to speak to that a bit more, the intention here when we conceptualize this program is that we did so with the principles of the AODA in mind. So we looked obviously at integrating, concepts around independence, dignity, integration, quality for opportunity, and obviously the ability to age in place. So what does this mean on the suite-based kind of level? We've obviously come up with this prototypical layout that includes things like, roll-in showers. We've gone through the process of waterproofing the entire bathroom to allow people to literally roll into their shower, providing transfer spaces for toilets, roll under countertops in kitchens and bathrooms, easy to reach storage, committing space to side-by-side washers and dryers, not just providing stacked washers and dryers, providing very generous clearance spaces, providing rollout balconies, so low profile thresholds at your balcony door to allow you to actually get outside to enjoy your balcony, providing power door operators for your suite entry door and for your balcony door, lowered peepholes. I mean, we've gone quite to a granular level with all of this.
That's
the goal
excellent.
being that, you know, your house is ultimately very warm and inviting. We want to get away from it feeling clinical or institutional in any sort of way. So we've tried to go to the nth degree to make sure that that's the case. So beyond that, I mean, we've created kind of a subset of ADP suites, and we've created, you know, a prototypical 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom to respond to people who may be living by themselves or be living with their family in their unit. And we offer these units within condominium tenure at no additional cost to the purchasers. So we bake in all of these accessibility features, and obviously our mandate is to do so with no additional cost realized to the purchaser. And then beyond that, when somebody makes a commitment to buy one of our condos, one of our ADP design condos, we take the time to kind of consult with them to further upgrade their unit. I mean, we've obviously kind of developed the program around people navigating through their unit in a mobility device, but we realize the spectrum of accessibility goes way above and beyond that. So we take the time to sit down and understand individual needs and kind of customize unit design in that vein. And then outside of that, I mean, and I know I'm not going to go too long. I know.
Cut you off soon.
Yeah, no, I'm going to wrap up. Don't worry. We look at kind of the broader experience of coming home. What does it mean to come into your lobby, to interact with your concierge, to get a parcel or to get mail, to get into the elevator, to go down to your vehicle, to use your amenity spaces? What happens in a fire life safety event when you need to evacuate the building? Like we've put a lot of thought into this. And again, I've kind of baked that into all of our projects going forward.
Excellent. I heard a lot of words today: comfort, cost, dignity, joy, access, safety. These are all things that people deserve. It's our right to deserve these things. This is what I describe as full citizenship, and everybody deserves full citizenship in this country. To save some time, we're going to do another round of questioning, but I'm going to collapse the questioning, the 3 questions I had, into one, so we can look at what questions we have in the chat. So I'm going to ask that each panelist now, considering they told us what accessibility means to them, now I want you guys to answer, well, where do we start? If we were to do something now, what would that be? Where is our starting point to getting to those dignified, joyous access of affordable housing that you all articulated so eloquently? So Noma, where do we start? You've identified all these barriers. What are the solutions? Where can we start today?
I think the first thing is maybe we need the government to put some laws to mandate landlords to have accessible units, whether the new buildings or renovate the old buildings. Like if a building is going to stay around, then why it doesn't have an accessible unit? That's one thing. I know that now we say that landlords have the duty to do renovation to meet clients' need without undue hardship, but that can be very flexible and people can really get away with it. So I think we need clearer laws, regulation, and enforcement of them. Maybe the government can also help with just to make it more tempting to landlords to do that. Like, I don't know, for example, reduce their taxes if they have certain number of accessible units in the building. Just a thought. I don't know. It's very important also, Peter, to have the right people on board. Usually home assessments are started by OTs. So let's bring skilled and experienced OTs on board. We need honest contractors who can really commit to the work. OTs and contractors together, I think, can work towards creative solutions that can sometimes reduce the cost of things. Yeah, we need people to work together. We need everyone to work together. We need something from the government. We need something from professionals. And as people with disabilities ourselves and advocates, we need to continue to bring this up until we live in our own homes with dignity. As you said, Peter, it's Canada, it's 2021, and we are still speaking about safety in my own home, independence in my own home, which is not right.
Thank you for these ideas. Rob, we have an Accessible Canada's Act. We have a new government. We have a housing strategy. Where do we go next? What can we do to build accessible housing now?
Sure, and I think I do also want to address some of the questions that are in the chat, because I think there is somewhat of a misunderstanding around the federal legislation. The federal government can only put legislation in place in areas that the federal government has jurisdiction. Housing is not a federal, constitutionally, housing is not federal. It is a combination of municipal and provincial. We are providing funding, absolutely, and to the point of $72 billion in a national housing strategy. But when that act was put into place with the goal of making an accessible Canada by 2040, someone is asking why housing's not there? Because it can't be there. I mean, that is, I hate to say it, but that's the civics part of this, that we need to find a way to have provinces and municipalities that work on zoning issues and work on provincial housing programs to get into this. So the first thing I would say is, yes, we do provide money. And someone says, why do we not require accessible units? We do. Frankly, the answer is yes. So I recently announced a new project at the corner of Broadway and Redpath. It's working with two developers that aren't as enlightened as Daniels, I'm sure, because Daniels, we know, is a very enlightened developer. But these two companies will be required in the rental units and to make sure the affordable units have a percentage that are accessible. Our new construction is not going to solve this problem. The housing stock in Canada is absolutely problemed when it comes to accessibility. And so that's going to take provincial and municipal governments, it's going to take landlords, it's going to take the demand from all Canadians to ensure that we change building codes. There are national standards, and we are working, we have provided funds for CSA to come up with those standards, working with a variety of nonprofit groups, and we will come up with them. But for them to be real, the provinces and municipalities are going to have to get into this. And that's going to take time. So here we are.
Rob, can I ask you one question? As the funder, the transfer payment agency, can't you put conditions that forces municipalities and provinces to work together, forces the percentage of units?
Actually, we cannot. We can stop funding, but we have the absolute concern that provinces have jurisdiction, and we will maintain that. And that's, same as healthcare. We have the ability to influence, we have the ability to withhold funds, yes, but we can't tell a provincial government what they can do in the area of their jurisdiction. We can influence it, absolutely. And so we are pushing on our transit funding, and we put conditions on those, as well as our housing funding, but it is a political will that needs to happen. So all the burden can't rest with one level of government when there are three levels of government engaged. That is just the reality of our Canadian Constitution. But we're pushing. Believe me, in the area of federal jurisdiction, where our act applies, we are engaged and it is moving. But it's also only a year and a half old. Let's be realistic about that act. It only came into effect in 2019. We will need to continue to push on it, but we have 10 provinces and 3 territories, each with their own acts that need to be updated to include these things. So the other reality is enlightened developers and builders are recognizing that this is the way to build. It is part of the way Canadians want their building. So my hope is that Canadians don't want to move into buildings that don't have a certain number of units that are accessible. We have to push on every level. we're going to do that. And I hear the frustration. I hear that, and that's why, you know, we gave $190,000 last year, I believe, to develop national standards. And we're doing that, but they will come out in 2022. We'll see how far that gets in pushing provinces and territories on them. I share the frustration. We need to do it, but it's a long journey, and we'll keep doing it.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm going to flip to Brock for a second, just because of the conversations around building and willingness to build. You know, Brock, if the world would say, you know what, anytime you build, it has to be accessible, has to be universally designed, what barriers would that bring to your corporation? Saying that from now on, stairs don't exist. You have to build and design differently. How would you respond to that?
That's challenging. I mean, it fundamentally changes the economics of what we do. And I mean, we've had this conversation ad nauseum with a number of different people, and it's such a challenging thing to respond to, because I mean, when we develop our buildings, we are always seeking efficiency, and we know that designing for true accessibility just requires space. Obviously, units in Toronto are getting smaller and smaller, and at the same time are getting more and more expensive. So that's very difficult. I don't have a very pointed response to that.
Well, tell us where we can start then. Tell us where we can start in terms of moving towards more accessible housing in this country.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we've done has been meeting with collaborators and meeting with people who know a lot about this, to listen to what has been happening. I mean, the good thing with Daniels is our president empowers his team to go and just do things, like just stop talking about it, go do it, go figure it out. So, I mean, we're in the process right now of starting to occupy some of these ADP units that we designed, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. The buildings have now been built and people are moving into them. And through that process, we're getting a lot of exceptional feedback from people who are living in these units. It's been really intriguing. We don't for a second profess to get all of this right. We have had a lot of criticism and feedback to say that we need to do better. But the good thing is we've been getting really good constructive feedback about what we need to do, and we're committing the resources to improve the program, you know, month after month. So it's been really, really interesting. And I mean, we've developed this program. We're going through a process of, again, overhauling it, and we have the opportunity to roll it out in so many different tenures, you know, market condominium, rental units, affordable rental units, barrier-free and ADP suites, traditional housing for youth, homeless youth, retirement and seniors housing, student housing. So through that process, we generally find ourselves aligned with all sorts of partners, and our goal is to always talk to them about the rollout of this program, to enlighten, you know, these seniors providers and these pension funds that we need to be doing this, you know, across the board, despite tenure. So it's been really really eye-opening.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. Jas Great, what are your 2 cents worth? What do we need to do? What are our next steps in terms of where you feel from your perspective around housing?
I think it just starts with recognizing and agreeing that housing is a basic human right. I think if we just started with that and realized, like, we all deserve to have a place that is safe and one that we can access, we might change how we look at things. Like, I've heard a couple of things here, and I don't know who it was exactly. And this is stuff that I've heard when I was looking for, you know, this unit, that, you know, this building has a couple that are considered accessible. And so then I inquired about those, and they said, well, those are already sold off. And I said, are they sold off to people that, you know, have a need for them, people that are with disabilities? And they said, we aren't sure. And I was like, in my head, I'm like, I think you just sold those off to whoever, because I don't think you were allowed to ask if they needed if they had a disability before they purchased. So that was a little bit off-putting to me. And then we've heard in this conversation that the accessible units require a bigger space. And I'm going to agree to that to some degree, because yes, I would like to turn without bumping into my walls all the time. However, I don't require that much big of a space. I just require some adaptations. So a standard unit that I've looked at now has, and I've looked at quite a few for myself and just other people, they're usually sort of against the wall is where all of the sink, the stove, the fridge, and all of that is. If we could just look at the space that it is, this is a 500 square foot, and compare it to what it was supposed to look like before and what it looks like now to make it accessible for me, truly not that big of a change. It was just a want from the builder to do it. Yes, they required some extra money from me, and I'm happy to hear that Daniel's, is creating ADP approved apartments and units. But it's just realizing that we all deserve housing. And if we were to make it universal from the start, then the 15% of people with disabilities right now would be able to buy, purchase, and use those. And I know that people with disabilities don't always have, might have financial issues. ODSP isn't all that great. If you have an injury and then you lose your job, you don't have that money anymore. So yes, I know that affordability is a question, but if we're looking at new housing, why are we not trying to make it all accessible and doable? We also have an aging population, and we know that as people age, that they might require mobility devices and walkers and will need to have access to things. So let's build for the future. Let's build for the people that are currently disabled and also the people that are aging. And then a spinal cord, when I acquired my spinal cord injury, I did not know that this would happen. I did not expect it to happen. And I'm sure that hundreds, thousands, many people who acquire SCIs didn't realize that they were one life event away from acquiring their injury. And so if we also realize that, then we can say that every single person that is able-bodied right now potentially might acquire some sort of injury that might put them at a need for accessible housing. So yes, I know we have current housing that needs to be looked at and fixed, but all new housing, and I know this is a federal, municipal, there's different levels of government. I just think we need to look at it and realize we're all people, we all deserve housing. Let's just build for that. Why don't we build our new housing to be accessible for all? And then the current housing that we have, we can look at and we can figure out. So
thank you so much. At this time, I've been paying attention to the chat, and I'm going to start pulling out some questions. I'm going to ask the question, and I'll lean on my panelists who want to answer the question. So the first question I pulled out is, the Accessible Housing Network calls for the building code to be changed to require that new apartments be accessible from that point forward. Will that work? Any response? If we change the building code now, that all new units need to be accessible, what barriers and opportunities would that bring? Brock, Rob, Street?
Well, that would
mean
anyone that is looking for a house, disability or not, able-bodied or not, mobility device or not, would be able to purchase and use that house. So I think that's one thing that would happen, but I can't answer the second.
Brock, I'm curious how the building code, what influence does it play in your job? Right, like, is it something that is easy to work within? Does it create barriers? Does it need to be strengthened? Does it be weaker? Is it a good lever? Is it not a good lever? What's your perspective on building code towards accessibility?
Well, I mean, obviously we need to meet it, but our goal is to kind of far exceed what the OBC and even the National Building Code requires. And there's some kind of congruencies between them, but we've determined that we need to go well above and beyond to try to provide, in our minds, what is more accessible housing. And we do so in a way by working with our architects and interior designers to creatively introduce those elements into our projects. It's challenging. I mean, we certainly have no problems meeting the OBC requirements in any of our new buildings. They're not moving quickly enough at all. Like they need to be much more aggressive. I mean, we're having the same conversation right now around climate change and all the challenges with that and how much faster all of this needs to be moving. And I've seen kind of conversations or comments pop up that are kind of suggesting agreement with that. Just not enough speed in any of this.
Mhm.
If I could weigh in here, I think
Yeah.
Brock raised an important issue. It's the economic equations that everyone is working on here have to take into account that, frankly, building accessible housing is more expensive than building non-accessible housing. It just is more expensive. And yet that cost of that should be spread out over society. So we're talking two things. We're talking the practicalities that an accessible unit for a person who is blind versus deaf or hearing impaired versus a spinal cord injury versus, versus aging in place, all of those things mean that you can't build an accessible unit that is for everyone. I mean, they need to be planned and custom. They'll be more expensive. Now, our goal as governments is to say, how do we make it so that it is economically viable for a builder to do that, and that the cost of that is not borne only by the builder, because that's simply, we live in a market economy. And we also would argue that housing is a right. I mean, I have said that always in my life. So therefore, then levels of government need to come in. Yes, you level the playing field among builders by changing building codes so that all builders need to follow the same standards instead of just someone being more insightful or thoughtful than others. That's the one thing. So you change the building codes, but then the whole economics of all of this pushes people in and out of these projects. So that's where government has to step in. So you have to guarantee loans. You have to put in low interest rates for the builders to be able to do these things. You have to find ways to both subsidize the building and the builder and the subsequent owner of the units, but you also have to subsidize, as it were, the person who is living in the unit. So it's both kinds of things, making sure that people have an income where they can afford to live and that the prices are fair. I'm not trying to make it more complex than it is, because it's complex enough.
That's right.
But it's, I simply don't blame the builders because they live in an economic reality. We have to help the builders, and that's what the National Housing Strategy is doing. But we also have to have city planners think about this and think about the way we get permits done. In the 1960s and 70s in Paris, France, you couldn't build a new building without providing student housing in part of it. That was the rule, because the riots that happened in Paris were as a result of students not being able to find housing. And so when a builder put in a new expensive building, they had to put in units for students. We should be doing the same thing at our provinces and our municipalities regarding new construction. As I said, new construction won't solve this problem because the housing stock in Canada is still, we're going to have way more old housing than we've got new housing, but it's a start. Then we have to look at existing housing to figure out, how do we fix this to make it better? Not an easy solution, but the burden of this should not be on people with disabilities to carry the ball. It shouldn't even be on Spinal Cord Injury Ontario. It should be on all of us, because we're all better when everyone does it.
Exactly.
Sorry,
so I think
I keep preaching, but
no, we like your preaching because we're looking for solutions, so we appreciate that. So I think we're going to have time for one more question before we start wrapping up. And I'm just seeking through the chat here, and I'm looking at some commentary around subsidized housing. And there was a comment in the chat describing how the majority of subsidized housing are in buildings with high crime rates and risk the safety of people with disabilities. How can we reimagine subsidized housing to be more spread apart so people can live in the area of which they choose, as opposed to being forced to communities that are not their choices? Noma, do you have anything to share about your experience with subsidized housing and the experience around the areas that have those subsidized housing areas?
Yeah, I've noticed that accessible, subsidized, and affordable places are not spread equally across at least Toronto, where I'm living and working. And that's why I started by saying it's my right also to choose where I want to live. So the whole conversation on how to make accessible building, if it applies to all across the province, then we won't have this problem. But I agree with that comment that many of those buildings are even not in a great shape, not properly maintained, not cleaned well. Yeah, it's very frustrating sometimes when we do home visits. We see things that are not nice at all.
Brock, I'm going to pick on you again. Can people apply to the Daniel Corporation condominiums? Can we utilize those spaces for subsidized housing in any which way or form to increase the stock of accessible housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question obviously leads me to reference what we've done within Regent Park, both as a model to integrate market housing and subsidized rent guaranteed income housing. Literally townhouses that are designed, one side of the street will be market condominium units and the other side of the street will be rent guaranteed income units or subsidized units in some way. I mean, we've just also within Regent Park created a model where a subsidized rental provider has taken a head lease and actually rented a number of units in one of our projects with the goal of actually integrating rental units within fully integrated units within one of our buildings. So it's been a really successful model, and I know that we've been trying to speak to other industry cohorts about adopting it and kind of running with that as well. So I think our work in Regent Park is somewhat emblematic of this, but obviously more needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Recognizing it's 1:57, I just want to take this time and thank each and every one of you for your insightful and eloquent explanations. We clearly have a lot of work to do. That's what I got out of this panel, is that there's so many different pieces that need to come together to make this right. And I'd love for Rob to help us be a voice in the House of Commons. There's a lot of people here with high interest in seeing something done. And we also hear Rob's comments very well that we as an association and a membership need to do much more in influencing municipalities in the province to create that synergy across all levels. And as well, working with corporations like Daniel's and influencing and expanding the work that they're doing around their ADP program to other builders, and then harmonizing co-ops and all other methods of housing where we can all live the life we choose. And as much as I say these are all great ideas and all this harmony has to happen, what needs to be in the center is listening to people with lived experience who live this every day and understanding their needs every day so we can roll through these barriers and smash them and give people the life, joy, and dignity that they deserve. This is great that we had a first start, and I really appreciate all the work and time and effort and energy that all of you have put into this panel.